Hey guys, how are you doing? I'm Professor Arjun Sondhi again, and today we would continue where we left off last time. So the last thing we talked about was the PPF model, and I'll give you a second to come up with what it stands for before I move on to the next topic. And I'm sure you guessed correctly, that's the production possibility frontier. So that's where we talked about how a country decides if they're wanting to use all their resources, what to produce in what quantities, whether we want to produce more of good A or we want to produce more of good B. Today we're going to conclude chapter 1 by talking about 3 more concepts within a basic economy. So first thing we're going to talk about is the different kinds of economy that there are. So we've talked about we have unlimited wants, we have limited resources, and then how do we produce them. So 2 basic structures of an economy that we can work in. One is a centrally planned economy. So in an economy which is centrally planned, there's a central organization, or we all call that a government, which decides A, what gets produced, B, how we produce them, and C, for whom we produce them. So there is no individual choice or by firms or by consumers, but there's a government that decides all of those choices, and then they just tell the people how much they can buy of each good and what price they're going to pay and all of those questions. The other extreme is called a market economy. A market economy is where, as you can see from the word, the most important term there is the word market. In a market economy, a market determines all those questions that in the centrally planned economy the government did. So in the market economy, the exchanges between goods and services happens without any central organization. So if you think of in the real world, the only purely centrally planned economy today that we have left is probably North Korea. Most economies are a mix of the two, but when you think of centrally planned economies, North Korea is the example that comes in mind. A market economy, since there is no central government, it's important to determine how exchanges take place, right? So if you want to buy more food, you don't have to ask anyone, nobody has to tell you to do so. You just go in the market and you buy it. When you think of a market, again, don't think of a physical place. It can be going to a grocery store is an example of a market, going to your car dealer is an example of a market, going to your classroom is an example of a market. Also, it can be virtual, right? What we are doing here. So me providing education to you, but we are not meeting in person, is also an example of a market. It can be both virtual or physical. Now, one important aspect of a market economy is how do we determine whether I want to buy something and how much I'm willing to pay for that. The key function of a key property of a market economy is that the price of a good determines everything. So in a centrally planned economy, we have the government. That tells us you have to buy 10 cars in Delhi and you have to pay 1,000 rupees. So that's there's no choice made by me. In a market economy, it's the price that determines. So if a price of a car is a lot more than I want to spend, then I will just choose not to buy that car. If on the other hand, if the price of a car is very cheap, then everyone is going to run out to buy those cars, and then the producers will be signaled that they need to raise the price of a car. So we'll talk more about how price works in a market economy when we talk about some concepts later on. But for right now, you need to know that the basic difference between the 2 kinds of economies is one, you have a central planner, and in the other, you have a market that determines everything that gets produced and for whom it gets produced for and how much people pay for it. Now, if you think, like I said, of an example, most economies are somewhere in between, and that's called a mixed economy, where a market determines everything, but we do have some government involvement. If you think of any example, India, US, Germany, they're all mixed economies. The difference is the degree to how much the government intervenes. So that's a basic introduction of the different kinds of economies. A couple of more things before we conclude the chapter is the difference between normative and positive economics. And the last thing is the difference between micro and macroeconomics. So again, as you probably have noticed, chapter 1 is introducing you to a lot of concepts that we will get into in more depth later on. So before we conclude the chapter, we have a couple more things that we have to talk about. One is the difference between normative and positive economic analysis, and lastly, the difference between micro and macroeconomics. Positive economics is what we use to see how the different parts of an economy functions, and then normative economics is how we evaluate them. So for example, if you make a statement such as interest rates going up in an economy leads to lower inflation, or when people have more income they will spend more on goods, those are positive economic statements. You're stating facts rather than your opinions. Normative economic analysis deals more with evaluating how things are. Now when you do that, it is more opinionated and there's more judgment rather than stating facts. So for example, if you say, I think the government should spend more money on infrastructure, or I feel like the government should lower taxes, those are examples of normative statements as opposed to positive statements. And then last thing in the chapter is the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics. This class is for microeconomics, which looks at different individual components of an economy. For example, if I ask you, how much do you want to earn when you get your first job? That's a micro question. If I ask how many cars should Tata produce this year, that's a micro concept. All of those are looking at an individual component of an economy, whether it's a consumer like you, or whether it's a producer like Reliance or Tata, or whether it's a government, Reserve Bank of India. All of those are micro concepts. Macro concepts looks at an economy as a whole. So instead of asking how many cars should Tata produce, if we on the other hand ask what is the overall level of production in the Indian economy, that is a macro concept. We are not concentrating as much on one producer in one part of the country. Rather than that, we are looking at a whole economy, which is the whole country. When we talk about macro concepts, we don't focus on one area or one consumer, rather as opposed to the whole economy. So that's so obviously in this class, we will concentrate on micro. So we will evaluate the decisions made by a firm. We will evaluate the decisions made by consumers, which is going to be the next class, is how do consumers, which is you and I, make our decisions. The choices we make, whether to buy more of one or the other good, how do we make those decisions is going to be a micro question, which is what we will get into in the next class. So that concludes chapter 1. We talked about what is economics, what's the purpose of a simple economy, what are the decisions that gets made in an economy, who decides those, whether it's a government or a market, and then some simple concepts that we will keep coming back to as you learn more concepts. So hopefully chapter 1 has convinced you that economics is important. Whether you like it or not, it is every decision you make is an economic decision. You spending time to listen to me lecture you right now rather than going to eat lunch or drink coffee or talk to your friends is an economic decision. So now from the next chapter, we'll start getting into some more elaborate microeconomic models, and you will see that soon enough when we get into the next chapter. Thank you, have a good day, and I will see you next class.